answer to this question that no, Microsoft does not have a corporate social responsibility to develop and distribute this app unless it were in the unique situation that they were the only people who could create this app. Our presentation will have a couple of parts. First, James is going to provide some context, background with which we can look at this case. Second, David is going to provide our central ethical theory, that which our case will hinge upon. Third, James will provide some counter-arguments, those positions that might come up in the minds of others. And finally, David will look at our recommended course of action. At the end, I'll wrap everything up. So with that, James starts off with context.
Thank you, Krister. So from the first, let's acknowledge all of us that the controversy surrounding this app is not whether or not Microsoft ought to produce it, but whether they should produce it. The reason we've given the caveat to our answer is to say, we believe that this is a good app, that is a permissible and morally permissible app. Most of our argument revolves around that because most of the objections revolve around whether or not this app commits moral evils in its use. But as we establish that the app is good and acceptable, we'll also be doing it with in mind this exception that should Microsoft be the only one who could produce an app like this, then we would think it would be their responsibility as a corporation to provide wholeheartedly. So first, context to demonstrate that we believe that this app and its use are good. Firstly, to describe the app itself. It is an application that provides safe walking directions, or at least so the patent seems to say. That it would include some algorithm that incorporates published violent crime statistics for a certain district to help route pedestrians who are unfamiliar with the area. In the same way that the current Google Maps technology allows you to incorporate weather or traffic patterns or fastest versus longest route. This would have a similar feature, a toggle to include safety, whether or not there's an area is considered to be, has certain threshold for violent crime. Now this app is not particularly unique. Other apps similar to it exist. For example, if you can look on the iTunes Store, there's an app called the Sex Offender app. It's a Sex Offender Finder. It's a very similar concept that it uses the published statistics, or the published addresses, that is, of known sex offenders in a certain neighborhood, and it allows you to see them on a visual map. So it's not a particularly unique technology. Also, its usage is discretionary on the part of the user. Not only do they have other options for which app that they would use, but they also, we presume, have the ability to toggle this option on and off. It's not as if this particular application forces the user, if you will, to take a certain route. Most mapping technologies that are currently on the market today allow any number of factors to be incorporated that allow you to adjust the route based on your preferences and your own history. It's just one further algorithm, which we presume would be discretionary. Now, fourthly, to continue to illustrate why we think this app is a good idea and helpful to society, we're going to consider who would be using it. This is the pedestrian, not in a car, walking through an unfamiliar area, likely wanting to find out how to get from point A to point B with minimal risk to himself or herself. This person, as the pedestrian, we consider to be the most vulnerable party in the equation. Other parties in the equation being other members of the neighborhood, other members of society at large. The pedestrian, unfamiliar with the area in which he or she is walking, is the most vulnerable party. This is going to illuminate which ethical theory we choose to validate why this app is a good idea. With that, I'm going to hand it over to David, who will give us our ethical framework.
Thank you, James.
Oh, there we go.
And for our main ethical theory, what we're going to look at is Rawls. And we think Rawls is applicable because he talks about this veil of ignorance. That is, what are the rules we would assent to? What are the policies that we would assent to if we did not know who we were going to be, where we were going to be, what kind of person we were going to be? And he says that it's clear that we would assent to two basic ideas. The first one is that we would want the most extensive basic liberties that are compatible with everyone else's basic liberties. That is, we don't know what our desires are going to be, we don't know what our goals in life are going to be, so we're going to want to be free to pursue those things. And the second rule is that when there are going to be inequalities in a system, we want to make sure that everyone benefits and that with a special eye on the weakest party. That is that we want to make sure, because we could be the weakest party in a situation. It seems very clear that we could end up serving in that sort of role. And seeing that we want to have a special eye on the weakest party, as James was talking about earlier, we recognize that in this situation, the person who would be using this app, is the weakest party. And with the weakest party idea, they would be the weakest party because, A, they're unfamiliar with the area. They wouldn't be using an app to walk around their own neighborhood. They're clearly in a place that they don't know, and they're looking for a way to get some talks about trying to lead walkers to areas of high visibility where there's less crime, where there's less things that they should be worried about. And so we can see that in this situation, the walker is the weakest party, that the walker should have access to the sort of information whereby they can make decisions that keep them safe. With that, I will pass it to James for some arguments.
Thank you, David. So I want to make sure that the distinction we're making in this case is absolutely clear. The question asks, does Microsoft have a corporate social responsibility to develop and produce the app? We presume that means something like, this app is so good and so necessary that not only is Microsoft allowed to produce it, but they absolutely must. The reason we've answered no is because we see no proper ethical grounds on which we could demand Microsoft produces this app. There's a whole world of app producers who could do a similar thing. That's why we've made our little exceptions. But we're sort of putting that aside for a moment and addressing the real concern with this app, which is our main relevant counter-argument. We presume that the counter-argument is an answer to the question, no, because not only does Microsoft not have a corporate social responsibility, this is morally impermissible. We anticipate the argument that this app actually does perpetuate certain facets of society which we are unhappy with. So now that I've made that clarification, let me address this counter-argument. The counter-argument comes from the source which labels this app the Avoid Ghetto app. That's given it a certain level of infamy, saying that it is actually going to perpetuate racist stereotypes. As it mentions in the case, it's going to perpetuate this false sense that being poor and non-white and criminality go hand in hand. In other words, that this app is going to have increasing negative social effects by directing walkers through what are presumed to be safe areas, labeling a certain area unsafe, and more or less removing it from social consequences. We will address this in the following ways. Firstly, the information which Microsoft claims to use in this patent are statistics that are public record. This is analogous to statistics that would be present, say, in a guidebook. When a tourist looks in the guidebook and says, which areas of town would it be appropriate for me to go visit and which would be more dangerous? Now, surely none of us would take issue with him or her looking in this book and asking, well, should I use these statistics in this way? All this app does is it conveniently and fluently organizes already available information. If we argue that that information is in fact unethical, then by implication, we would also argue that accessing these published violent crime statistics themselves would always be unethical. Really, if we want to scrutinize this app for its potential to perpetuate stereotypes, if we really want to say that these violent crime statistics for convictions that are published by the state are themselves racist, let's acknowledge what we're doing. We're putting our scrutiny on something outside the scope of this case. That is, the justice system overall and the accuracy of our violent crime policies. If we want to do that, by all means, we welcome that conversation in another venue, but let's acknowledge we're moving the scrutiny away from the technology of the app, which is necessarily valid, and to the source of information that it has. If the information is faulty, by all means, let's correct that information, but let's not silence the medium and tell Microsoft, you can't produce this based on the fact that there may be faulty information that may perpetuate falsehoods. If that's the case, again, scrutinize the stance. With that, I'm going to pass it back to David, who has our recommended course of action on this issue.
Thank you, James. And this is our recommended course of action. That Microsoft go ahead and develop this app, produce it, distribute it. They are not compelled to do so. There doesn't seem to be an overwhelming compulsion to produce this. There are other apps that do similar things. However, we recognize that it is a good for them to produce this. And in fact, we think it would be a compelling good were there no other apps that could perform a similar function. The idea that with the weakest party, that this is a compelling good to produce this for the walker.